Greetings, scholars. This is your review for Unit 5 in the Ancient Regime, Europe right before the French Revolution. Some questions from our review sheet here. What developments enabled Great Britain to achieve a dominant position between 1700 and 1830 in Europe here? And you have the agricultural revolution is allowing more food to be produced for the growing cities. The enclosure movement and crop rotation on the seed drill are allowing the English to grow more food for their people. England has good roads. England has good canals and has coastal transportation by ship. There's internal free trade compared to, say, Germany and many places in Europe where there's fees charged every time you cross somebody's border. There's coal and iron deposits which allow for the production of iron. You have the introduction of steam power, which powered pumps and mines and eventually were used for early railroads. You have a stable and representative government. Now keep in mind this is a very limited government to the nobility or the aristocracy, but you do have a stable government and a representative parliament. You have independent courts. You've got sound credit. You've got rich banks which provide capital, and this capital was accumulated through earlier overseas colonization and trade. You've got growing cities, you've got a growing textile industry, and you've got all these inventions, the spinning jenny and power looms and the water frame. And mercantilism will give way to free trade. So England has a lot of things going for it, which puts it in front of other countries as far as economic growth. Concerning the 18th century agricultural revolution, what caused it? Well, remember the fallow field system, which was around for really centuries. You always had to leave some land fallow for natural composting and the natural, allowing nutrients to come out of the ground by leaving it untouched for a period of time. And they figured with crop rotation, if you use clover, if you plant legumes, nitrogen-fixing plants, you can use the same soil over and over again if you rotate your crops. And this was a huge improvement in agricultural yield. You have Jethro Tull's seed drill, which allows for a more efficient planting of seed and getting more production out of an acre of land. You have the enclosure movement, where small individual stakes lands and especially the common pastures are being fenced off, and these poor farmers are being forced off to the cities. But what this is allowing is more productive, more efficient production using farm machinery. In the Netherlands, you have dikes and windmills, which are allowing the Dutch in particular to reclaim land from the sea for agricultural production. What were social and the economic consequences of the agricultural revolution? Well, you can grow more food. You can grow more food more cheaply, and this is going to allow people to be healthier. You have a reduction in illnesses. You have an extension of life longevity. You have just longer life expectancies, and you can feed more people in the growing cities. These things are happening concurrently. As more food is grown, more people are sort of pushed off the land, and they're going into the cities, but we can feed them because more food is being grown. You might want to, some historians throw into here the agricultural revolution, the introduction of American crops from the New World, in particular corn and potatoes. And this allows more production, especially potatoes. You can grow them in sort of sandy, rocky soil. And in particular, we think of Ireland with the introduction of the potato into Europe. How did social and economic developments affect women in England between 1700 and 1850? Well, the enclosure movement, which forced people off farms into cities, some of these people are women. So many women are heading off to the cities with their husbands. Women are working in textile mills. Although first at home you have this domestic system or the putting out system, but that sort of created a bottleneck. So as the factory textile system develops, you have women working in the textile industry for cheaper wages than men, of course. You have many women who move into the cities, become domestics, become maids, and the very, very poor, you have prostitution. As far as the middle class goes, there's this idea of the cult of domesticity, and this is an ideal, and most women are not middle-class stay-at-home moms, but increasingly you have this idea that the middle class, the woman should stay home and she should help educate the children. She should be involved in church work and charity. The hearth and home are being cared for so that when the man comes home from work, there's a safe place for him to sort of restore. Unmarried women were able to work in unmarried middle-class women were able to work some jobs without stigma. That would be a teacher, being a clerk, being a secretary. You don't have nurses. Just know you don't have nurses until after the Crimean War in the 1850s, but there's some fields which were acceptable for unmarried middle-class women. And you have smaller families. As the middle class grows, you have less children being born. Effectively, you have practicing contraception and later marriage. Generally, women were kept out of the universities, were kept out of the professions, and one woman of note, one of the most famous of the sort of proto-feminists, is Mary Wollstonecraft and her vindication of the rights of women. What were economic, technological, and institutional factors responsible for Western Europe's domination of world trade from 1650 to 1800? Well, as far as economics, some things we already talked about. You've got the growth of the agricultural revolution, which is allowing cities to grow, urban areas to increase in population. You have the early industrial revolution, which is increasing the standard of living by increasing the production of what's output. You have mercantilism is going to give way to free trade, especially in the Netherlands and in Great Britain. You have the triangular trade, this trade between the Americas, Europe, and Africa. And as far as the American perspective, it would be America, Africa, and the West Indies. You have the commercial revolution, which is preceding the industrial revolution, and this is based on world trade and the accumulation of capital in the cities of Great Britain. Think of London, think of Bristol, think of Amsterdam, where money is accumulating because of an extensive and growing overseas empire. You have joint stock companies. Think of the East India Company. Think of the London Company that sponsors Jamestown. And these companies are being pushed by investors who want to find wealth overseas. Technology, some technologies that spur Western European domination of world trade, be the caravel, which is this very flexible, maneuverable sailing ship. You have navigational aids, which allow you to find where you are when you're in the middle of nowhere. And you have the sextant, the quadrant, the astrolabe, the compass. You have the use of gunpowder and the use of iron and eventually steel when you confront the natives, whoever they are, and you're sort of imposing yourself upon them and creating colonies. You have the use of canals, and eventually in the sort of the mid-1800s, really, you have the introduction of steam power onto railroads. But you have this industrial revolution, which is allowing the production of more cloth, more clothing, and again, the use of steam power, the use of iron. Institutions, some institutions in Europe that are allowing strong nation states to grow. Remember the creation of strong monarchies, especially in the, say, the 1500s here. And they're going to fund exploration. They're going to support settlement and trade overseas. You have the slave trade is imposed on the Americas, and all the European powers are involved in this. The Dutch, the English, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese are all getting, some wealth is coming to Europe from the kidnapping of Africans and bringing them mostly to the Caribbean and South America, and to a lesser extent into North America. You've got missionaries which are going to be taking European culture to the natives, especially in Latin America. And you have dissident religious groups such as the Puritans in English North America. And that's pushing settlement as well as the hope for economic gain. Remember this guy, Max Weber, or I was saying German Max Weber, he's going to be writing that Calvinism in particular in Great Britain is supporting a work ethic of sobriety and frugality and honesty and hard work, which will lead to prosperity. Another question here, what were the effects of the expansion of the Atlantic trade on the economy of Western Europe? Well, think of the Columbian Exchange, the introduction of new crops, which allow farmers to grow more in their plots of land, in particular, again, potatoes and corn. You have the creation of new colonies, and you have this exports of raw goods to the mother countries of Europe. You have Spanish silver and gold being introduced into Europe, creating inflation. Holland is a major trade power in the 1600s. That's kind of their century. 1500s, think of the Spanish. And in Holland and the Netherlands, you have the growth of a banking system. You have small industry, and the Netherlands is a maritime power at this time. Again, the African trade, slave trade, will be bringing wealth to European cities, European nations. You have an increasing standard of living. Remember, standard of living is what you can consume with what you make. And as more is being produced, in particular through textiles, people are able to consume more, and you have a growing middle class, you have growing urbanization, growing cities. The commercial revolution, remember, this is the growth of overseas trade, especially I think of London, I think of Amsterdam, these cities that become the centers of exploration and settlement and overseas trade. You have this rivalry between England and Spain. You've got English pirates basically plundering Spanish ships, and you've got the attempt of Spain to take over England via the Spanish Armada in 1588, which was a failure, but one of the effect is trade wars, wars between the English and the French over North America, say during the 7 Years' War / French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763. Why was there no lasting peace between the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War, and the Peace of Paris, 1763, which ended the French and Indian War? I have a chart on your review sheet here. You've got the Anglo-Dutch Wars, or the wars between Britain and the Netherlands, and the causes here. The Dutch are challenging English mercantilism. The Dutch are trading where they're not supposed to, and England's going to challenge Dutch primacy here through a series of wars against against the Netherlands, and in places like North America where the Brits will take, for example, the Dutch, the New Netherlands, name it New York. The outcome here is after William and Mary's take the throne in 1688 after the Glorious Revolution, England will control the sea, will grow, and the Dutch control will diminish. And the Dutch are eventually going to be attacked by France as well as by the Brits on the ocean. The Dutch will basically lose their grip and their primacy by the end of the 1600s. The War of Spanish Succession, this is a bloody war. See, it's about 900,000 casualties here. This is a war of the empty throne of Spain, which is claimed through bloodline by Austria and France. And the French are worried about having a Habsburg on both sides in Austria and Spain, and other countries are worried about having a dual Bourbon monarchy. So the sides here are basically France versus just about everyone else: Austria, Prussia, the Dutch, and England. This ends with the Treaty of Utrecht, in which there is a Bourbon French heir on the throne of Spain, but the deal is there will not be a combined Bourbon Empire or Bourbon super nation of France and Spain. There's no uniting of the French and Spanish kingdoms. They are separate, even though Bourbon does take the throne in Madrid. And a balance of power is maintained at the end of this war. The Great Northern War from 1700 to 1721. Remember the cause here. Peter the Great wants land on the Baltic, which is being held by Charles XII of Sweden. And the outcome here is Charles will lose. The Russians will get this land on the Baltic, and Peter will be building St. Petersburg, which is symbolically this window onto the West, as Peter tries to modernize his country and to catch up with the Western Europeans, especially the French and the English and the Dutch, whom he visits on that famous tour that he makes as the Tsar Incognito, especially when he's working, remember, in that Dutch shipyard. The War of Austrian Succession, this sees about 500,000 casualties between 1740 and 1748, and the cause here of this war is the Habsburg Emperor dies without a male heir, and the pragmatic sanction is this turning over of the Habsburg Empire to a woman, to Maria Theresa, and Prussia takes advantage of this weakness here in Austria and seizes Silesia from the Habsburgs, and this plunges Europe into this destabilization pushes Europe into a war. It's basically Prussia backed by France and Sweden and Spain against Austria backed by Britain, the Dutch, and the Russians. And this war ends in the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, in which Maria is maintained as Emperor of Austria. Prussia does keep Silesia, which sees Prussian ascendancy at the expense of Austria. And basically, Austria is weakened and Prussia is strengthened at the end of this war. These two German states, one is moving up, one's moving down. The 7 Years' War, which is also called the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, this is just a huge war in Europe, and it starts really when Prussia invades Saxony. The Prussians are slowly expanding their power, and the Brits are fighting the French in North America over control of the Appalachian region between the Mississippi and the Appalachians. And in Europe, this is basically Prussia attacks Saxony, and taking Saxony's side are going to be the Austrians, the French, the Russians, the Spanish, and the Swedes, and on Prussia's side will be Britain because of this connection with the House of Hanover. Remember the Hanover Germans, George I, and those guys are now on the throne. And this ends with the Treaty of Paris, and Canada does go to Britain. Prussia gets to keep Silesia. And last here on our review sheet here, what was the Commercial Revolution and how did it change European society and change Europe's economy? Well, the Commercial Revolution, it's different than the Industrial Revolution. It's before this. It's the accumulation of capital which will be used to sponsor, to fund the Industrial Revolution. But the Commercial Revolution is the growth of overseas trade as Europeans have explored and are making settlements in the New World. And think in particular of the Dutch and the English, but also the French, Spanish, and Portuguese are bringing goods to Europe. And the Commercial Revolution, again, becomes the basis for the platform for the Industrial Revolution, which is coming, and with the growth of cities. But cities here in the Commercial Revolution are growing, and cities before this are basically centers for government and for religion. But with the Commercial Revolution, they're going to be centers of increasingly growing trade. One thing that's associated with the Commercial Revolution is this idea of mercantilism, the idea of restricted trade, that the colonies belong to the mother country and should ship raw goods, which the mother country will manufacture and change into manufactured goods, which will go back to the colonies. The idea is not to leak money, not sort of a zero-sum game idea that if you buy from another country or another country's colonies, that you're leaking money. So the idea is to keep trade in the family, keep money in the family, to avoid making your competitors rich by giving them your money when you're buying trade goods. And this trade competition, especially in the Americas, will lead into the French and Indian War as the compete here for the Ohio River Valley, this trans-Appalachian area west of the Appalachians. You also have that War of Jenkins' Ear down in the Caribbean, where the English are sort of forcing they say they have the right to sell slaves to the Spanish, and this is breaking that mercantile system, and eventually they will win this right. But the Commercial Revolution, the growth of trade and wealth in European cities, and the growth of banking. Well, there you have it. There's some thoughts on the review here for the last test we have before we hit the French Revolution and Napoleon. So study early, study smart, study. Signing off.